welcome back to Constitutional Chats. Andrew, would you like to give an overview of the topic before we kick it to questions?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Tova. Listen, it's a pleasure to be on. So when Kathy reached out to me about this, which with the concept of the role of the state in protecting individual rights, I thought we were going to be talking about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 9th and 10th Amendments, really. But then in talking with Kathy again, and then with Lacey, given what we've all been talking about with regards to war powers, it became really clear that and with next week's constitutional chat being about federalism, this was a really good bridge topic, which is that sort of that division of power between the federal and state governments when it comes to this issue of national defense, which really is a collective exercise of protecting individual rights. That's what national defense is. And actually, weirdly enough, to start with, it's not even starting with the 9th and 10th Amendments. We actually start with the Second Amendment, which is frequently misunderstood. And especially when folks focus on the concept. Remember, the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And people focus on that concept of the militia, and they think it means the National Guard or the reserves. And we're going to be talking about the National Guard in a minute, but that's not what it only means. And in point of fact, unlike a lot of terms in the Constitution, militia is defined in the United States Code. And there are two classes of militia. There is the organized militia, which is folks who are in the National Guard or the reserves. And then there's the unorganized militia, which essentially means, anybody between the ages of 17 and 45 years old who is able-bodied and living in the United States. That's we're actually technically all able-bodied males. They haven't updated that. But that's an interesting sort of way of looking at it. For those of us who would like to see terms within the Bill of Rights more carefully defined, like under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, the definition of what constitutes public use for the purpose of a property rights taking. But also because it certainly gets around those who proffer that the Second Amendment is supposed to be construed very narrowly. It is not. It is a very broad-based amendment, as all amendments are, right? All amendments sort of they are about constraining the power of the federal government vis-a-vis the states and the people, as the 9th and 10th Amendment say. Anyway, but I say that as an introduction to this issue of the constitutional structure, right? If I were doing the federalism discussion next week, I would be talking about, and I am going to talk about I would be talking about a case called New York versus United States, in which Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said, the Constitution protects us from our own best intentions. It divides power among sovereigns and among branches of government precisely so that we might resist the temptation to concentrate power in one branch as the expedient solution to the crisis of the day. And that's from a 1992 case, New York versus United States. And then Justice O'Connor goes on to say that federalism secures to individuals the liberties that derive from the diffusion of sovereign power. And what that means is that we break down power in order to protect those individual rights. But then we get into this issue of, and I'm going to talk about something called the anti-commandeering principle in a moment, but we talk about the National Guard, right? We have an active duty military, which is 5 branches now. And that's not, so it's the Army, Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, and Space Force. To some extent, you have also the Coast Guard, you have the U.S. Public Health Service, but all of those things. But those are your active duty military members. And then you have these things called the National Guard, and they are reserve units that are organized by the states themselves. And they have as their commanders in chief the governors of those states. And those serve two real purposes, the National Guard. They are supposed to respond to kinds of crises within state borders, and to do so in ways that normally the federal military cannot, under something called the posse comitatus statute or the posse comitatus act. I'll get into that in a moment. But also they are there to be mobilized in the event of national emergencies and international deployments, so foreign operations. And what's interesting is that under those two titles, Title 10 of the United States Code and Title 32 of the United States Code, what you have is the governor retains the governor of a state retains control over those National Guard units when they're engaging in training exercises or domestic operations or domestic disaster operations. But once they are activated, these National Guard units get activated for federal service in the international realm, then the president of the United States becomes their commander in chief. And obviously, we have the divided principles in terms of war powers, as we've discussed on previous episodes or previous shows, between the president and Congress in terms of how they act. There's seamless integration. Guard units serving alongside active duty units in combat zones are integrated into those things. But what we have is a degree of organizational and operational flexibility and versatility, which means that they can be plugged in wherever they are needed. Now, the bottom line here is that once a reserve unit, a National Guard unit is called up, then the governor cannot refuse, called up for international service. Like if we go into a war or some kind of international peacekeeping operation, the governor cannot refuse those things. But if they're called, for instance, down to the border to act, and I know we're running short of time, governors can and have refused, such as the situation in which in the previous administration, the president called for National Guard units to go down to the border, and the governor of Maryland refused to send troops there. The Posse Comitatus Act, real quick, means that military operations, military organizations cannot be used to enforce the law, like normal judicial law. Again, that's would be a violation of the separation of powers doctrine. But by the same token, the flip side of this is something called the anti-commandeering principle, which means that under federalism, state governments cannot be commandeered, and state government facilities and local government facilities cannot be commandeered by the federal government to be used for federal law enforcement principles. So this was enunciated in a case called Prince versus the United States, in which county and local police organizations were being co-opted by federal law to enforce federal anti-gun laws. And that was the Supreme Court resoundingly came down on the side of the states and federalism in that case. I know we're running short on time here. I could talk more about that in the questions, but let me open it up now to Q&A since it is 2:15 my time. Take it away, Tova.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that amazing overview. I also just want to remind our audience that we want to hear your questions too. So if you have anything you're wondering about, any topics you want to be expanded on more, please put that in the chat, and we always make sure to get to as many as we can after our questions. But to start off, I wanted to ask a pretty broad question, but I think it's very relevant about you had a comment about how national defense, ultimately aims at protecting individual rights,
Right.
Which I think is true. However, there's also kind of this inherent paradox that, in order to have individual rights, we need to have national defense, but also sometimes national security kind of has to violate individual rights in order to achieve that, whether that's privacy or, if someone poses a danger, detaining them or depriving them of rights in that sense in order to protect national security. So can you just give a bit more context to this debate, particularly how it's developed throughout U.S. history?
Our good friend Horace Cooper, who I think has done some of these constitutional chats. I know he's done a lot of work with Constituting America. Horace is fond of saying that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. That in the end, right, in order to have a republic to endure, you have to have a republic, right? And so the federal government has to have certain powers in order to keep Americans safe. What you're talking about, Tova, is what I like to call the push-pull, right? There's this constant tension between the two. But the reality, of course, is that the courts have enunciated this, that you have essentially this strict scrutiny application of any expansion of power. It has to be done in a way that provides the maximum protection of individual rights in a way that is, or protects the American people in the way that offers the least impact on their individual rights. If you see what I'm saying. So, for instance, obviously, we recognize that if you are someone who works for a federal agency and you have a security clearance, or somehow you come into possession of documents that are of a very sensitive national security nature, well, then their court has to weigh very heavily as to whether or not your First Amendment rights trump the security of the United States. And you know, and courts will say that, courts will draw that bright line, but again, they'll do it in a way where they will try to find a way that maximizes that First Amendment right to free speech or freedom of the press, but still does what it can to protect it. And obviously, over the course of American history, we've had a series of acts and this tension between the power of government and the rights of individuals, whether it was the Alien and Sedition Acts or the Logan Act, which is an act that says that individuals can't negotiate on behalf of the United States with foreign powers. And, you know, and we have an act like this on the books, the Logan Act. And yet I don't think anybody since Dr. Logan himself was first prosecuted for the Logan Act has ever been either prosecuted or convicted for violating the Logan Act. So there's a recognition that people have a certain right. If you are a former government official, you have a right to have conversations with foreign powers about what's going on in the United States, provided that you are not representing yourself as that agent of the United States. If you've never seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, I highly recommend that. It's about a congressman who essentially works hard overtime behind the scenes to defeat the Soviet Union. And at one point, he references the fact that he's coming very close in his discussions with the nation of Pakistan. He's very close to violating the tenets of the Logan Act. So yeah, so that's what it comes down to. I'll offer up one more example in all of this, because I am largely a free speech absolutist, though I do recognize this national security issue is vitally important. We hear quite often people will misquote this concept of, you in order to argue for a limitation on free speech rights, they will say, well, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And the reality is that that comes from an overturned Supreme Court case law having to do with someone charged under essentially at that time sedition laws, a socialist, for publishing what could have been construed as an anti-American pamphlet. And so, and I don't remember, I want to say it was Justice Frankfurt, it might have been Justice Brandeis, writing for the court, said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater to justify this level of censorship. Well, thankfully, that case was overturned down the road. So when someone brings that up to you, say, no, that's been overturned. Not that we want people yelling fire in a crowded theater, but the reality is that's not the justification, and that justification has been discarded by the Supreme Court.
That's very interesting. I did not know I've heard that phrase a lot. I did not know that had come from that case. That's very interesting.
It's a World War I era case, and obviously, you know, we went through, but before the Red Scare of the 1950s, we went through a Red Scare of the 1910s and into the 1920s, and so that's you know, that comes out of that time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And then I kind of wanted to change tracks and ask, I'm in a class right now on grand strategy and international relations. I literally have it right before this, so it's always on my mind.
Sure.
And we were learning about how kind of the geopolitical, the geography of the United States is really interesting because we don't have any natural land enemies compared to like the European context from which we emerged, where there's all these powers fighting. We kind of have seas on either side, Canada, Mexico. So we don't have to deal, as we're in a very advantageous physical position on the global stage. We don't need to worry as much about physical invasions. So I was curious about, in the context of protecting citizens, how this affects kind of the role of the Constitution, or at least the philosophy of defense. Is there now more focus on, I mean, I guess this, just maybe describe that change throughout history, because I also know at the beginning of the United States that wasn't the case. We were very much at war at home.
And I hope that you're reading about Halford McKinder and others in that class. In fact, I essentially minored in strategic geography with my major, but so this is a really interesting topic for me. Some of it is obviated by air travel, and so there's a real I mean, obviously, you guys did a constitutional chat last week on border security, southern border security. I'm sure it was the focus of it because that's a huge issue. But the other part of this, of course, is air travel, and actually it really gets into, again, this push-pull, right, Tova, which is, you know, how your rights to travel freely are impacted by our national security apparatus and what we need to do to protect ourselves, and all of the things that were changed in the wake of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Little things like not being able to travel with, you know, or carry onto the plane any liquid above 3 ounces, having to have these multiple forms of ID, having to go through essentially, in some respects, X-rays before you get on a plane. But we recognize that nobody has a fundamental right to travel by plane. In contrast, of course, and actually, this is a whole nother issue. I didn't even think about this. I was about to say, we recognize that you have a fundamental right in America to travel by car. That being said, any of our viewers or listeners in the American Southwest know that that very frequently there are checkpoints that are set up well within the United States on major roads to stop people and check IDs. And that to me raises huge questions about civil liberties in terms of your ability to travel in the United States. But yeah, I mean, it changes based upon the threats. It changes based upon the attacks that have happened or that have been stopped from happening. You know, I'm sorry, I'm reminded of the guy who tried to light his shoe on fire, John Walker Lind, and how that changed again how we bring liquids on planes, because he tried to douse his shoe in some flammable liquid and set it on fire. But that's, and then technology goes the other way, which is the question of you know, the concept of real ID and how you go and you get an identification from your state and how that translates into your ability to travel both domestically and internationally in terms of when you show up for a flight. The technologies that go into passports to sort of defeat the ability to smuggle people in the United States. I'm sorry if it seems like I'm rambling, Tova, but it's, you know, it's a lot of different things that conspire in this. You are correct. You know, from about 18, well, let's say after the Civil War. So you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the 1840s. You have the end of the American Civil War. The United States controls essentially all of the territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific, north of the Gulf of Mexico and the Rio Grande River, and essentially, with the exception of Alaska, south of whatever parallel it is that does our border with Canada. And so we're not worried about an invasion from Canada anymore. We're not worried about an invasion from Mexico for a lot of reasons. We were very worried in World War I and then into World War II about naval attacks and invasions from first the Germans and then the Japanese. Geography would seem to obviate a lot of that need, but it certainly doesn't change the concerns. Oh, and let me add to this. Yeah, I was going to go down the road of nuclear weapons, but we don't need to. That really doesn't change the calculus for constitutional purposes.
Well, thank you so much. That was like I gave you the broadest possible
Yep.
question and you answered it so perfectly.
Thank you.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
And I see we have Janine with us now.
Yay.
So hi Janine, thank you so much for hopping on. Is now a good time to go to you for some questions?
Well, yes, unless Jill and Jordan want to go first. Why don't, thank you. Hi, Tova. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you. Jill and Jordan, why don't y'all go next? And hello, Lacey. And I'll jump in after that because I look forward to it. I want to make sure we get back on track of the when I asked my questions about the federal and the state and what Abbott said about why the state has the right to protect. So, but Jill and Jordan, y'all go, and I want y'all to go next.
About so our national guards are our state's militia,
right? And
what we're seeing now is in the issue in Texas is that the government is ordering for the states to send the guards to what word am I looking for?
Well, their interaction and where does the authority come from
to effect in Texas. So, and if the state doesn't agree, where is that line? can the state stop their guard from going?
Yeah.
You just
Yes.
lay
Yeah,
whole.
they can, and in fact they have. So by example, Governor Larry Hogan did that back in whenever during the Trump administration. President Trump wanted to deploy National Guard troops down to the border, and Larry Hogan refused to send them down there. So governors can do that. On the other hand, if we're talking about a military operation overseas, and the Department of Defense needs a guard unit to be called up, the governor cannot refuse that. That's just so the way things are shaken out, both in terms of general agreement, general practice, and the Constitution, but also under statute.
Is there a constitutional like provision for the extent of a state's right to military power? So if the state wanted to set up a militia that didn't have to fight overseas if they didn't want to, or I mean, you could like plug in whatever reason you want. Could they make a militia that is not under federal authority at all?
I don't believe so. I think if it were tested in court, now you would be getting into essentially 9th and 10th Amendment arguments, really 10th Amendment arguments. And I think a court would look at it and say that because the principal role for national defense is the federal government, and the what was used to be called the War Department is now called the Defense Department, because they have power and the president's commander in chief of those armed forces. Then they couldn't set up their own army that was doing that. Now, on the other hand, right, not that we need to be finding ways around it. I mean, essentially, you would be talking about a militarized police force, and a lot of states have some measure of that. It's not their own army per se, but you have your special weapons and tactics units and your state police units, and that would suffice that. But you would be hard pressed to find a state government that would want to go sort of that route and essentially duplicate efforts of the National Guard units that are within their midst.
Is there any, that brings us to another question too, is when we see these tactical departments that are under the state executive power,
Right.
I believe, have they ever been constitutionally challenged, and are those, what takes it from being a police force to a military force?
Well, I think that's just it. I mean, I think it's a matter of state legislatures that they determine these things. I don't think there's a bright line test that has been drawn, but there's been a great debate amongst the civil libertarian community, especially as state and local police units have gotten military surplus over the years. Federal military surplus, weapons and equipment. This militarization of police forces and the impact that it has in terms of how operations get done, et cetera, et cetera. Some of this, I think some of this comes into just the what's the word I'm looking for? The logistics of it all, right? The efficiency of it all, how much money these states have to spend, and then the priorities themselves within those states, right? The two states that come to mind would be Texas and California. I can't imagine the California state legislature being particularly amused if Gavin Newsom tried to set up his own private army. Of course, that being said, well, anyway, not that we want to stay away from politics here. There is a movie coming out which posits that very scenario, and I'm wondering how they're going to deal with that.
And then when we see the Constitution, basically, and we froze for a minute, so I think you probably covered some of this, where the military is not supposed to be citizen.
Yeah.
And it's really taboo it on American soil, and it's mentioned sometimes where we're getting close to this, or this could happen, and it could be like a domino effect.
Right.
Want to stay away from it. When we look at the Justice Department and some of the way that it's targeted our own American citizens, and in some of the techniques that they've used, is there ever anything raised beyond like constitutionally, hey, besides the criminal aspect of why this may not be allowed, but instead making the case of, hey, if I do a protest and then FBI SWAT's at my door the next morning and they kick in my door, that's a use of like military force
Right.
against the family.
Right. I mean, listen, this gets into, Supreme Court case law, thankfully, is very broad and powerful on this issue of the so-called chilling effects. And I don't mean so-called in a negative way. I just mean that they're called the chilling effects on free speech. That's the entire intent. Whenever government power, and whether it is police power or military power or surveillance power, is used in a way that is essentially designed to intimidate somebody into silence, well, then the court weighs down heavily on the side of the individual. We've got this situation, for instance, in which pro-life activists have seen themselves, they were not prosecuted for violating certain local laws, but the federal government came in and has prosecuted some under violations of certain federal statutes. And so one wonders about the question of issues of double jeopardy there, and duplication in the law, right? There's a constant debate over when federal laws are designed specifically to be duplicative of state and local laws, when someone believes that state and local laws are not being enforced because of someone's particular political position on an issue. The problem, of course, is, and this gets into why we have a federalist system, we're supposed to have dual sovereigns. We're supposed to have states having a greater measure of protection over the public health and safety in their individual communities, because they are not only at the level closest to deal with that and effectively render that assistance, but also it's the easiest to control. But if you have a federal government that is duplicating state laws, well, it's much more difficult for the people to exercise their control and oversight over how that is being discharged. And we've seen that a great many times in recent years.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's time we're going to pass over to Janine for her questions.
That was fast. Okay, you sure? Yeah, I don't have another question. You're good?
Go ahead, Janine. If there's extra time at the end, we'll always ask another one.
Okay. So, hi, Andrew Langer. How are
Hello,
you?
Janine. I'm good.
Good to see you. And thanks. Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I'm joining late. Okay, so I really find it very intriguing, this discussion between the difference between federal and state protection of its citizens.
Yeah.
And the way Abbott put out a statement that we didn't get to touch on much last week, where he talked about the difference between the articles that give the presidents the power and the articles that give the states the power. So let me just read what Abbott said, because I think it's interesting. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and the other visionaries who wrote the U.S. Constitution foresaw that states should not be left to the mercy of a lawless president who does nothing to stop external threats like cartels smuggling millions of illegal immigrants across the border. This is why the framers included both Article 4, Section 4, which promises that the federal government shall protect each state against invasion, and Article 1, which of course deals with the legislative branch, Section 10, Clause 3, which acknowledges the state's sovereign interest in protecting their borders. So this gets into that territory of where the federal states begin and end, and when the federal begins and ends. And that they're quoting the court case Arizona versus the United States. That was a quote from a dissenting opinion for that. The failure of the Biden administration have triggered Article 4 has triggered Article. Okay, so he says that the fact that the Biden administration is not abiding by Article 4, Section 4 has triggered Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which reserves to this state the right of self-defense. For this reason, Abbott, which is just interesting that, any governor, this is just states, has declared Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 to evoke Texas constitutional authority to defend and protect itself.
Right.
The authority is the supreme law of the land and supersedes any federal statutes to the contrary. the Texas National Guard, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and other Texas personnel acting on that authority as well as state law to secure the Texas border. So I just think that's really interesting that Abbott would bring in, you know, the where the president has the power, but if he fails to do that, the states can step in. And now and I always get really tripped up, and I think it's fine to reiterate this for the students, between, you know, the National Guard, which is actually the state militia.
Right.
But right now, from what I understand, the Texas National Guard is in the rivers of the Rio Grande, preventing people from coming in and not allowing the federal border control. Well, they're not really pushing the issue anyway, even though they got the Supreme Court ruling. They're not coming in. So it's the Texas National Guard that is acting on the state's behalf, that is taking over to protect the states, according to this Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. And I just think that's really, really interesting, because Texas is not being protected. And then that flows out to all the other states that aren't being protected. So I don't know. I find this whole federal state thing really, 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 really intriguing.
Whenever we talk about this, you know, you go back and you think about what is the problem that the founders were trying to remedy, right? And now again, things change over time, but the basic rules are there, and it's important to look at the why, you know, not the language. So why does the Second Amendment exist in the way that it does? Why do they talk about well-regulated, which means effective, not you know, regulated in the same way that we think about it today? Why did they want to ensure that the people had a right to keep and bear arms? In this instance, why do they make it clear that every state ultimately has the right to defend its borders? Well, because back in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, travel around the United States was hard, and we still had enemies who wanted to invade our borders. Well, whether it was from the South or whether it was from the North. And in point of fact, right in 1812, we very much had that, where the British attacked us not just along our eastern coast, but also along our northern borders with Canada, which was still, you know, British provincial territory in some ways, some areas French provincial territory, but mostly British. And so the idea was to ensure that the states had the power to defend themselves, right? This gets into, again, the concept of dual sovereignty, which is a concept that we've really lost pretty much since the Depression and the Depression era Supreme Court jurisprudence. The idea that, and this gets into a case that I mentioned earlier, which was the Prince case. I've been trying to find the quote. I can't find the quote. In terms of this issue of dual sovereignty, that states are not political subdivisions of the United States, that the states are not on any organizational chart of the federal government. The federal government has its administrative units, and the states have their own, and they are essentially equal sovereigns with equal liberties. Now, the other part that you get into, Janine, was the inducement to ensure that the states both joined the original union of the 13 colonies under the Constitution, and then to encourage states to join, or territories to join, the United States once they wanted to become states after the original 13. There had to be some both guarantee of protect and defense from the federal government, and that absent that, you know, protection and defense by the federal government, that they would be their powers to act on their own behalf would be ensured. So, you know, whether it is ensuring that, you know, New York knows that it can defend itself, or Virginia or Vermont or whomever, in the late 19th into the early 20th century, or, you know, or the states along the Rio Grande, who came in after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, you know, to make sure that they can defend themselves. If the federal government isn't going to step up and to defend themselves against an invasion from Mexico, historically speaking, we're talking about the 19th century here, they should be empowered to act on their own behalf. But there is some hope that the federal government will do its job. But absent the federal government doing its job, the states have that power to protect their own citizenry if they need to.
Constitutionally.
Yes, absolutely.
According to this statement, which I just want to read one more time.
Please.
Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. which acknowledges the state's sovereign interest in protecting their borders. At least
Right.
that's what he's saying here. So, and I just really have one more question though. But it's interesting to me that the state militias have also been called the National Guard, and that
Right.
confuses me.
Right.
And right now, one second, I just want to add to the question. In the Rio Grande, you have the Texas State Militia, which is the National Guard, actually pushing people away, saying you can't come in, and that's not the federal government's, the national government's doing that. That's the state, the militia is acting under the state's authority, and yet they're called the National Guard, and so that gets very confusing to me. But what's interesting, I thought you touched on it, and I'm not sure I totally comprehended it because I came in late. But who is the ultimate authority over the state militias? Because the state militias right now are listening to what Abbott is telling them to do, but they're also the National Guard. So it's tricky stuff.
Acting under color of statute, federal statute under the United States Code. So there are two things that happen, two different titles under the United States Code, Title 10 and Title 32. So under Title 10, that these National Guard units, when they are called to federal active duty status, so they are activated for international overseas deployments to backfill and be used in Department of Defense operations, they are no longer under the command of the governor of the state. He is no longer their commander-in-chief. They are now under the auspices of the president, who is the commander-in-chief of the United States. But if they are activated for domestic operations and training exercises, then they remain under the command and control of their governors. So this is why, yes, Governor Abbott can activate, if he declares some kind of state emergency that requires a military response within his state's borders, he can deploy Texas National Guard units to the border under Title 32. But by the same token, if, let's say, the president wants to deploy troops to the Texas border, National Guard troops, a governor from another state can refuse, as Larry Hogan did when President Trump tried to get Maryland National Guard units to go down to Texas to enforce the border.
Interesting. Okay, so my last question is Article 32. It's remarkable that you have all this information at your disposal. I'm very impressed. But Article 32, what is Article 32?
So
I mean, where did
Title
it,
32
what was it?
It's Title 32 of the United States Code. So, so you have, so you get, Congress passes a statute, and those statutes become the United States Code. That's our statutory language. That's the body of federal law. And then, not to get too far down into the weeds, but then those laws get turned into regulations through the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's how they get enforced by executive branch agencies. So Congress, look at what the Constitution said, has passed a series of laws to codify and define these terms. So you hadn't come on at that point, but for instance, one of the things I quoted was Title 10 of the United States Code, section, hold on, now I got to pull up in my notes, section 246, which defines who's in the militia, right? That word that's used in the Second Amendment is defined in federal statute under 10 U.S.C. section 245. The unorganized militia, which is all able-bodied males age 17 to 45, and female citizens who are members of the National Guard. And then there's the unorganized militia, which is the National Guard and the naval militias, and then the unorganized militia. So those terms get defined by Congress in statute. Again, as we separate powers, it's up to Congress to define those terms. When it comes to the president, in terms of war powers, the president is commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, but then we get down to the issue of these National Guard units and how militia gets defined for state purposes.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
So the states have, I don't know, we could talk about that forever about but okay. So
but I mean, Janine,
the states have power. Mhm.
Yeah, the quickest thumbnail is, if it has to do with a foreign military operation where the troops are being integrated into an ongoing Defense Department operation, then the governor's no longer commander in chief. But if it's something domestic related, you know, a national emergency, whether it's a disaster, like a natural disaster, or some kind of a crisis at the border, then they remain under the control of their governors.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That
You're welcome.
that was really great. I finally understand that. Thank you. Okay, I'm going
You're
to
welcome.
pass to Tova or Julian Jorn or questions, whatever it may be. Thank you. I'm so glad
You're
I
welcome.
understand that now. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Janine. We'll now go to some audience questions. We have a lot, so thank you all so much for putting your thoughts in there. Feel free to keep those trickling in. So Curtis Clark asked, what's the difference between an unorganized and an organized militia? Is there a distinction?
Yeah. So an organized militia is essentially your National Guard units. That's what we're talking about here. But the unorganized militia is essentially everybody else. So for the purposes of the United States Code, it's any able-bodied male between the ages of 17 and 45, which of course, getting into the issues of various laws that are being passed to try to prevent people between the ages of, say, 17 and 21 from owning firearms. There are some significant not just constitutional, but statutory questions, whether or not such statutes would be in violation of federal law. But that's basically it. To me, the thumbnail is essentially the organized militia are these National Guard units. The unorganized militia is everybody else, because I think there could be a case made that people outside of age 45 really should not be excluded from this. But that may be something Congress has to take up. I would be afeared that they would go in the other direction and raise the age of who's considered in the unorganized militia.
Okay, thank you. And then John McFarland asks, could you comment on state guards, which several states have formed? Florida has a state guard, which is completely separate from the National Guard.
Well, I'm not quite as familiar with that as I would otherwise. It really all depends on the purpose that they're being used for. Now, if they are informal but chartered by the state, I think it all depends on what the stated purpose is. Right, here's the reality. The reality is, again, within this concept of the separation of powers and dual sovereignties, states have a great deal of power to exercise on their own behalf, up to and until it interferes with, the powers that have been expressly delegated to the federal government. Right, the states traditionally cannot interfere in those realms where powers have been delegated to the federal government itself. So, for instance, you have if you have a Florida guard. That Florida guard cannot be independently deployed to, let's say, an overseas environment. I'm not even sure that Florida guard could be deployed, maybe not even the right word, to another state. Then again, you consistently see emergency operations where folks engaged in emergency operations in, let's say, Virginia will get called down to Louisiana in time of a crisis. But it gets I think a little bit more complicated when we're talking about paramilitary or quasi-military operations. So I would really need to understand better, and I apologize for not understanding better how the stated missions of those guards are. I think it has to be very carefully defined so as not to interfere with federal law.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And then Eric Braverman asks, during a crisis, can all the militia and guard be under the authority of the Secretary of Defense? So could you just discuss that topic a bit more?
Well, sure. I mean, if Congress declared war and all of these National Guard units were activated for the purposes of joining that war, then they would they would be called up. They would be a part of this, and I don't think there would be much for the governors to have a say in what they would do. Again, with Congress declaring that war, it gets a little bit more complicated when we fall short of Congress declaring war. Obviously, and I'm sure you guys have had discussions already about the War Powers Act and the limited amount of power that the government has for the federal government has for operations short of declaring war. But that's it is really, it would have to come down to well, let's say this much. It would really come down to a war, because if there was a national emergency in which the president was calling for guard units to be called up, it would be a huge break in tradition, for the president not to call upon that governor to lend his or her guard units to the effort. And it would also be, well, actually, it wouldn't be breaking tradition for a governor to say no, as we said, the aforementioned Larry Hogan. I'm pretty certain the case was made to Larry Hogan that there was a national emergency at the border. But again, if there was, if there was another, God forbid, I'm going to knock wood here, knock wood there. If there was another 9/11 attack in the United States, I can't imagine that a governor would not be willing to have his or her guard units called up and put under federal control for dealing with it, or exercising some greater diminution in control.
Great. And then Eric asked another question about, is it true that when Lincoln was afraid the Emancipation Act was unconstitutional, he had the Secretary of State sign the Emancipation Act as a military necessity? Do you know
Right.
anything about that?
Oh yeah, no, that is absolutely true. And in fact, Doris Kearns Goodwin's book goes into great deal of discussion about this. The film Lincoln, Steven Spielberg's film based upon that book, goes into great discussion of this, about the ways that Abraham Lincoln sort of bent the Constitution to his will, and frankly the real reluctance that members of Lincoln's cabinet had for him doing that. I mean, America was in, it's not understanding it to say America was in incredibly uncharted territory at that point. Not only was Lincoln dealing with the preservation of the Union and an ongoing rebellion within his own midst, and how do you deal with that, and how do you get through it, but then how do you bring the country together afterwards in a way where we could come back together as a nation, which is why he was, one might say, reckless, but on the other hand, he was very careful in how he twisted those interpretations in the end.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I didn't know about that.
And then sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, remember, as Lincoln said on the record, he didn't see that the states were in rebellion, but that it was certain people within those states that were in rebellion, and that he was in a war against those people who had taken up arms against the United States, but not the people who were within those states themselves. And so, anyway, so the emancipation was out of this military necessity, for a whole host of reasons. The same thing can be true, right? Does the president of the United States have the power to, or I guess Congress, has the power to issue sanctions against a country? That's, you punish a whole country for the crimes of its governments anyway. So not that I want to go get too far afield here.
Wow, that's very fascinating chapter of history for sure. And then I know we touched on the Second Amendment, but we got a question from Andrew K that says, at the time that the Second Amendment was promulgated, it was presumed that almost everybody owned a firearm, that
Right.
Firearm owners knew how and when to use them, and that there was very little likelihood of those guns being misused. Don't the changes in circumstances today require some additional actions or safeguards? What would be your response to that, related to protecting citizens?
My response is well, listen, I don't want to get political. I will say it though. To reinstitute firearm safety training for individuals and go down that road. Right. Switzerland has mandatory gun ownership. And it doesn't seem to be a problem in Switzerland. Right. What part of the subtext of this question is, that's right. It was expected that everybody had a firearm and knew how to use it. Not necessarily that everybody knew how to drill together, but that's why they use the phrase a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Gene Volokh, who's a law professor at UCLA, has written extensively on this issue of what the concept of well-regulated means. Now, I'm a person who deals with the regulatory process in the modern sense, and it doesn't mean that. What the founders meant at the time was well-regulated meant effective, that it was regular and able to do the job that it was supposed to do. And what that meant was they wanted to ensure that everybody had firearms if they wanted a firearm, because if they had the firearms, chances are they knew how to use them and could use them if they were so called upon by the central government to do something.
That's a very interesting overview. I think we got through most of the questions. So, Jewel or Jordan, I know you mentioned you had maybe a question you wanted to add at the end. Would you like to ask it since we have a few extra minutes?
Yeah, it's obviously there's some hot terms that have come up recently. Everybody's talking about. So we know that the Lincoln, and you just touched on how Lincoln viewed the Civil War
Right.
as not a war against those states per se. When we're talking about an insurrection and military force use against insurrection, what constitutionally do you think needs to be met for something to be an insurrection, and for those statutes that we have, like Alien Sedition Act, those things, to come into effect?
Well, listen, I'm someone who, again, come back down on the side of free speech absolutism. You know, people have the right to say what they want to say, and more to the point, in a civil society, we want that. We want that for two reasons. We want people to have the freedom to say what they want, whatever crazy thing they want, both A, so we can look over and say, hey, that person is a crazy person, and I don't want to have I don't want to have anything to do with them. And B, because we want to take the craziest of ideas and we want to subject them to strict scrutiny. When you have any kinds of laws that drive people to tamp down on expressing those ideas, if they don't feel comfortable doing it, those ideas are allowed to fester. Part of the work that I did as an undergraduate in international relations was looking at how these things manifested themselves in the Central European republics, the former Yugoslavian republics, who had all kinds of ethnic dissents and ethnic angers toward each other that had been suppressed for 60, 70 odd years under communist rule, and it all exploded in sectarian violence when the communists were gone. We don't want that to happen in the United States. We want people to be free to discuss those ideas. Now, and to me, listen, to me, the definition of insurrection is very straightforward. It is the idea of violently overthrowing the government that actually has a chance of overthrowing the government, of instituting new power that is not derived from a mandate from the people, right? So the concept of a military coup, the concept of replacing somebody in power with somebody else of their choosing through military force that can actually go and do that power. Not that I want to go and talk about January 6th, but I have my own opinions as to here to me is, in the end of the day, the great lesson of January 6th, which is that the Republic endures, that regardless of a riot in the Capitol, that the Republic was going to endure. That just because some person in a buffalo head hat wearing face paint sits down in the office of the Speaker of the House, that does not make that person the Speaker of the House. That we have a constitution of which all the powers of our government are derived, and that act on that day was not going to change that.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. This was very informative. I want to give Janine and Jewel and Jordan, everyone, a chance to say goodbye. But thank you to all our viewers for being on and for all of your questions. And please join us next week for our 200th episode, which is wild. All right, anyone can say goodbye, but thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, Tova, great job leading us today. Thank you so much. And Jewel and Jordan, you're awesome as always. And Lacey and Andrew, you kind of rock. You rock and roll, and all the things that, and I like what you just said about the Constitution withstood the riot of January 6th. And I was thinking about Napoleon and how Napoleon went in and stormed kind of their Congress, and the next thing you know, Napoleon's in charge.
Right.
So that's a really good reason, and that's one of the reasons in that study we did in 2022 at Constituting America about American exceptionalism. It really is these documents of ours, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, that have continued to protect our rights and our liberties. Amen. And that we didn't fall into kind of a Napoleon takeover of someone who stumbles in. That none of those people got to take over our government. And we can thank our Constitution for that. Well said, Andrew.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.